The first time Selena Raywood truly understood she was already dead. She was standing in a palace full of people who claimed to love her. No blade touched her skin. No poison burned her veins. No enemy breached the gates. Yet everything that made her a living, choosing being had already been stripped away, piece by piece, under marble ceilings polished so bright they reflected obedience back at her. What remained was a body preserved for use, a future auctioned in silence, and a name that no longer belonged to her. Lyris called this peace. The kingdom rose in pale stone and strict geometry, a monument to control disguised as elegance. Its towers gleamed like sanctuaries, its courtyards echoed with order, its nobles wore restraint as proudly as silk. From a distance, Lyris looked untouchable. From the inside, it felt airtight. Every corridor was measured, every routine optimized, every life sorted into its correct function. Selena had been assigned hers at birth. She grew up surrounded by beauty engineered to calm and contain. Tutors corrected her posture before she learned to write. Servants adjusted her tone before she understood her own voice. Guards followed her steps so consistently that their presence faded into architecture, like columns or walls. Choice was never taken from her loudly. It was simply never offered. Her father, King Draven Raywood, embodied Lyris perfectly. Controlled, immaculate, unyielding. He spoke of protection the way others spoke of law, as something unquestionable and absolute. He never raised his hand. He never needed to. Fear in Lyris was not enforced through pain, but through inevitability. Resistance meant exile. Silence meant survival. Selena learned early that survival required adaptation. She became skilled at listening without reacting, at watching without being seen. She learned how to absorb instruction and return compliance polished enough to satisfy scrutiny. She memorized faces, tones, patterns. She understood that anger was dangerous, but curiosity could be hidden. The palace rewarded obedience and punished unpredictability, and she learned to appear flawless. Inside, something waited. When she turned 18, the wolf awakened fully. The transformation was supervised, recorded, treated as a ceremonial inevitability. Healers watched as her bones broke and reformed. Witnesses ensured the process followed tradition. Pain tore through her body with surgical precision, reshaping muscle and instinct alike. When it ended, Selena lay shaking, drenched in sweat and blood, aware of the world with an intensity she had never known. She expected freedom. What she found instead was clarity. The wolf inside her was not reckless. It did not crave destruction. It did not long for dominance. It recognized confinement instantly. Every locked door, every guarded passage, every false smile registered as threat. The beast did not want chaos. It wanted honesty, space, choice, oxygen. The palace responded by tightening its grip. More guards appeared, schedules shortened, unsupervised moments vanished. Selena was praised publicly and restricted privately. The wolf was treated as a dangerous asset, something to be controlled rather than understood. Selena felt it packing beneath her skin, restless but patient, counting seconds, memorizing exits, listening for weakness in stone and flesh alike. Then the announcement came. It was delivered without ceremony, without discussion, without hesitation. A date, a name, a political union deemed necessary for stability. No question was asked because no answer was required. The decision had been made long before Selena was informed. In that moment, something inside her collapsed completely. She was not being married. She was being transferred. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, precisely, politically. Her body was leverage. Her silence was currency. Her future was no longer even theoretical. The wolf did not rage. It sharpened. At the same time, the world outside the palace began to crack. Reports from the border grew urgent. Noctaria's name resurfaced in strategy rooms and whispered corridors. Troop movements accelerated. Messengers ran until their boots bled. The illusion of calm fractured beneath the weight of preparation. War did what nothing else could. It introduced chaos. Chaos disrupted patterns. Chaos reassigned guards. Chaos opened doors that had been sealed for decades. Lyris prided itself on control, but war demanded speed, not perfection. For the first time in Selina's life, the system faltered. She noticed immediately. Preparation began silently. Selina did not plan an escape the way stories romanticized. There was no packed bag, no dramatic farewell, no certainty of survival. There was observation, calculation, timing. She studied patrol rotations, supply routes, storage rooms abandoned because they were no longer efficient. She memorized which locks were ceremonial and which were real. The wolf assisted without impatience. The night she moved, the palace was loud. Metal rang in courtyards, horses screamed, officers shouted conflicting orders. Torches burned brighter than usual, casting restless shadows along marble walls. In the noise, movement blended into urgency. A single armored figure did not stand out. In a neglected armory reserved for damaged equipment, Selina found what the war had left behind. Armor stripped from a dead soldier. Scawed, ill-fitting, heavy. She fastened it with steady hands, ignoring the way the weight dug into her shoulders. The smell of rust and old blood grounded her more than any royal incense ever had. She bound her hair tightly and forced it beneath a helmet that erased her face completely. When she looked at her reflection in the dull steel, the image staring back felt unfamiliar and terrifyingly right. No crown, no jewels, no lineage, just a body capable of movement and violence. The wolf went silent. Selina stepped into the courtyard without pause. No one stopped her. No one questioned one more soldier among hundreds. She mounted a horse she had never ridden and joined the formation as if she belonged. The gates of Lyris opened. She crossed them knowing there would be no return. The march stripped away the last remnants of her former life. Dust coated her armor. Muscles burned. Sleep came in fragments stolen beside men who spoke openly of fear and death. She listened to stories of glory and loss, of homes that would never look the same again. The road did not care who she had been. For the first time, neither did she. The wolf tracked scent and terrain, alert and precise. Selina learned the rhythm of survival, the language of endurance. Every mile away from the palace loosened something inside her chest. On the third evening, smoke stained the horizon. The border town burned. Flames tore through broken stone, painting the sky in violent color. Beyond the ruins, the encampment of Noctaria stood disciplined and dark, waiting. Selina felt no regret, no longing for what she left behind, only certainty. If she was discovered, she would not be saved. She would be erased as a mistake. Her father would rewrite the narrative without hesitation. The wolf accepted this. Backward meant suffocation. Forward meant blood, truth, and consequence. Selina stepped toward the fire without fear, because for the first time in her life, the choice was hers. The battle began without warning, without ceremony, without any pause that might have allowed fear to arrange itself into something manageable. One moment the air was tight with anticipation, the next it shattered under the impact of sound and movement. Metal screamed against metal. Orders broke apart mid-command. Bodies collided with the brutal logic of momentum. The scent of blood cut through the smoke almost immediately, sharp and unmistakable, mixing with sweat, dirt, and the feral undertone of wolves forced too close to one another. Selina moved before thought could slow her down. Discipline carried her first. Anger followed close behind. She had been trained her entire life to occupy space delicately, to be ornamental, to exist as something observed rather than something that acted. That training was useless here. What mattered now were the lessons she had taken in secret: balance, timing, restraint, short movements. No wasted energy. No dramatic swings meant to impress. Her blade stayed close to her body, efficient and controlled, guided by instinct sharpened through necessity rather than formal praise. She refused the wolf. Not because it was weak, but because it was expensive. Transformation would tear through her reserves, drawing attention she could not afford. In the chaos of battle, a sudden shift would mark her as something worth targeting. The wolf form was power, but it was also hunger, and hunger led to mistakes. Selena fought as she was, human-shaped but far from fragile, letting the wolf whisper strategy instead of demand release. She survived longer than probability allowed. Time fractured around her. She lost count of strikes, of bodies, of moments where death passed within inches of her skin. She moved through the clash with grim focus, reacting rather than thinking, trusting muscle memory and instinct in equal measure. At one point, she intercepted a downward blow aimed at another soldier, deflecting it just enough to turn a killing strike into a glancing wound. The man stumbled away, alive, and vanished into the chaos. For a brief, dangerous second, something inside her surged. Not pride, not mercy. Existence. The wolf sang beneath her ribs, not in joy but in affirmation. This was what it meant to take space. This was what it meant to act and alter outcomes. Selena felt more real in that instant than she ever had beneath silk and marble. War noticed. In the confusion, her awareness narrowed too far forward. She focused on the threat directly ahead and failed to register the shift of weight to her left. The attack came from the side, fast and practiced. She turned too late. Steel slid into the narrow gap between armor plates at her shoulder, finding flesh with cruel precision. Pain detonated. It was not a scream, but an explosion of white heat that obliterated everything else. Her vision fractured. Her grip failed. The sword slipped from her fingers as her legs gave way beneath her. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving air from her lungs, the earth slick and uneven beneath her body. Sound dulled, color drained. She felt blood soaking into borrowed armor, felt the warmth spreading too quickly to be ignored. The wolf surged in alarm, pushing healing forward, but the wound was deep and her reserves were already strained. The battle moved on without her. Boots thundered past. Shadows crossed her fatting vision. No one noticed the fallen soldier who did not rise again. The sky felt impossibly far away. Consciousness retreated in waves, pulling her under even as her body fought to remain present. She did not know how much time passed before the noise began to recede, before the clash softened into scattered skirmishes, and then into the heavy, suffocating quiet that followed slaughter. When the field finally stilled, death settled in. Bodies lay where they had fallen, twisted and broken, armor torn open, blood darkening the ground into something unrecognizable. Smoke drifted low, clinging to everything. The air carried the metallic tang of aftermath, sharp enough to burn the lungs. Cale Morrow walked the field methodically. He had learned long ago that this was the most dangerous moment of battle, not the charge or the clash, but the silence after. Survivors clung to life in desperate, unpredictable ways. Mercy invited knives in the dark. Hesitation cost lives. Cale moved with controlled brutality, checking bodies, ending those who still breathed on the wrong side of the line. There was no room for doubt. His life had been carved by a single memory that never dulled with time. He had been a child when envoys from Lyris breached the inner palace of Noctaria during a moment of false peace. He remembered marble floors slick with blood. He remembered his mother's body collapsing, her eyes wide with shock rather than fear. He remembered the sound of her throat being cut while guards lay dead at their posts. Hatred had grown where childhood should have been. Cale had shaped himself into something capable of carrying that hatred without breaking. Every breath, every scar, every discipline-driven instinct served a single purpose. Lyris would never be allowed to forget what it had done. He did not believe in justice. He believed in erasure. He moved from body to body, efficient and unfeeling, until something inside him shifted. Not caution, not threat. Recognition. The wolf within him stilled, then rose, alert in a way it never was on the battlefield. Cale slowed, his attention drawn to a figure lying several paces away. The armor bore the marks of Leoris, but the body beneath it was wrong. Too slight, too still. The rise and fall of the chest was barely perceptible. He approached with weapon ready. Kneeling, he reached for the exposed skin at the soldier's neck to confirm the presence of a pulse. The moment his fingers made contact, the world broke open. Heat tore through his veins, violent and absolute. His breath caught, muscles locking in place as something ancient surged awake inside him. This was not emotion. It was not thought. It was command, recognition encoded deeper than memory. The bond struck with the force of inevitability, burning through every defense he had ever built. The wolf roared. Mate. The word was not language, it was truth. Cale's hand trembled as he pulled away, as if touching again might shatter him completely. His instincts screamed in opposite directions, tearing him apart from the inside. Every oath he had sworn demanded the death of what lay before him. Every instinct written into his blood demanded protection. With rigid movements, he removed the helmet. Blonde hair spilled free, damp with sweat and blood. A young woman's face emerged from beneath the steel, pale and strained, lashes resting against cheeks smudged with dirt. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her body fighting to remain alive. She was not merely beautiful. She was his. The realization hollowed him out. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Not the training, not the discipline, not the hatred he had sharpened into purpose. The bond did not care about history. It did not care about war or bloodlines or dead queens. It existed beyond morality, beyond choice. Cale gathered her into his arms without conscious decision. She weighed less than expected, fragile beneath layers of armor not made for her. As he lifted her, the bond pulsed violently, urging urgency, demanding distance from danger. His men noticed. They watched as their prince carried an enemy soldier with unmistakable care, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding. Cale felt their eyes and did not look back. He left the field with her cradled against his chest, every step heavy with consequence. He knew without question that this moment would destroy the balance he had lived by. The war would not end. The hatred would not vanish, but something irreversible had begun. The field behind him lay silent, indifferent to destiny. Fate had removed the helmet, and nothing would ever fit the same again. Selena regained awareness in fragments, as if her mind had been scattered across stone and smoke and slowly pulled back into a single shape. The first thing she registered was cold. Not the clean, polished chill of marble corridors in Lyris, but a damp, heavy cold that seeped through fabric and into bone, patient and absolute. The second was smell. Iron, ash, old torch oil, and something animal beneath it, the lingering musk of wolves and men who lived too close to darkness. She tried to move and discovered the limits of her body immediately. Her shoulder flared with a deep, brutal ache, not the sharp explosion of the blade that had dropped her, but the aftermath of it, the slow insistence that something had been torn and was still knitting itself back together. Werewolves healed, but they did not escape pain. Healing demanded time, and time demanded suffering. Her eyes opened to stone. The ceiling was low and uneven, built from rough blocks that held moisture in their seams. The air felt older than the castle above it, stale and salted with years of breath and fear. Light came from a torch somewhere beyond her line of sight, dim enough to turn edges soft and shadows thick. She lay on a narrow cot that smelled faintly of antiseptic herbs and old sweat. The mattress gave under her weight, thin and unsentimental. The cell around her was small, its corners swallowed by darkness. Iron bars cut across the front, thick and pitted, the metal blackened by age. Beyond the bars stretched a corridor of stone, lit in intervals by torches that cast a wavering glow. Somewhere farther down, water dripped steadily, a sound that made time feel slow and endless. Selina's first clear thought was that she had been taken alive. Her second was that her father would never allow that. She had grown up in a world where captivity was a performance. Prisoners were paraded, enemies were displayed. Punishment was theatrical because control needed witnesses. If Lyris captured someone important, they made sure the kingdom saw it. If Lyris lost someone important, they buried the truth and wrote a prettier story. Selina had expected death on the battlefield. If not by the enemy, then by her own side once they discovered who she was. She had expected the clean finality of erasure, the mercy of an ending that removed her from the cage and its future. Instead, she woke here, in Noctaria, alive and intact enough to feel the consequences. Her mind raced through possibilities with a cold clarity that surprised her. Torture to extract information. Execution delayed for political impact. Humiliation to strip the enemy of pride. Every scenario ended in spectacle. Yet what pressed on her senses was not the anticipation of an audience. It was presence. It sat in the air like weight. It filled the space between her breaths, thick enough to taste. Selina could not see it, but her wolf felt it instantly, bristling beneath her skin, alert and unnaturally quiet. The beast did not recognize danger the way it recognized this. It recognized something closer, something impossible. She shifted carefully, testing her body. Her shoulder protested, pain sparking down her arm, but the wound felt sealed enough to move without reopening. The healing had begun, steady and stubborn, weaving muscle and tissue together. Her fingers flexed. Her lungs drew a deeper breath. The wolf steadied, sensing that survival was possible. Then she felt him. Not as sound, not as movement. As a pull. A thread tightened in her chest, stretching outward through stone and iron, connecting to something beyond the cell. It was intimate and invasive at the same time, like a hand closing around her ribs from the inside. Selina froze, her breath catching, her instincts shifting from outward vigilance to inward shock. The bond did not feel like romance. It felt like law. It demanded recognition. She had heard stories, of course. Every kingdom told myths about the mate bond, shaping it to fit their politics. Lyris treated it as tradition, a useful narrative for loyalty and lineage. Noctaria treated it as sacred, something older than crowns. Selina had never believed it could be real in the way the stories insisted. She had assumed it was exaggeration, propaganda dressed up as fate. Now it burned through her like truth. The corridor outside her cell remained quiet for several minutes, or perhaps longer. Time in the underground did not move cleanly. It stretched and folded, turning seconds into minutes, minutes into something heavier. Selina sat up slowly, bracing herself with her uninjured arm and forced her breathing to steady. Fear was familiar. She had lived with it for years. But this was different. This was not fear of punishment. It was fear of being seen too clearly. Footsteps approached. They were measured, controlled, too steady to belong to a guard on routine patrol. The sound stopped just beyond the bars, close enough that Selina could feel the shift in air, the subtle warmth of another body in the cold corridor. The torchlight flickered, and the shadow of a tall figure fell across the floor of her cell. Cale Morrow stood on the other side of the iron. He looked different from the battlefield, stripped of smoke and motion, but no less dangerous. His armor had been removed, replaced by dark clothing that clung close to his body, practical and unadorned. His hands were bare. His posture carried restraint like a weapon, rigid enough to suggest violence contained rather than absent. Even in stillness, he radiated the kind of authority that made instinctive space around him. His eyes fixed on Selina, with an intensity that felt like pressure. He did not move toward the bars immediately. He remained at a distance of a few steps, as if proximity were a risk he could not afford. Selina understood without explanation that the distance was not for her safety. It was for his. The bond between them tightened, eager and relentless. It pulsed with recognition, sending heat through Selina's veins in unwanted waves. Her wolf stirred in response, not in aggression but in something rawa, something that leaned toward him despite every reason to recoil. Kale's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened, as if he were bracing against impact. Selina saw exhaustion threaded beneath his control, shadows beneath his eyes, tension in his jaw that spoke of sleeplessness. He looked like a man who had carried certainty all his life and had been forced to watch it collapse in a single breath. Selina's instincts demanded questions, demanded explanation, demanded a weapon in her hand. Yet the cell had stripped her of those options. The only power she had left was observation, and she used it. She watched the way Kale's gaze tracked her shoulder, the wound, the way his attention flicked briefly to the scattered pieces of armor piled in the corner of the cell, the leerous crest still visible in the dim light. She watched the way his fingers curled and uncurled, as if he were fighting an impulse to reach for her through the bars. He was not here as a rescuer. He was not here as an executioner. He was here as something trapped. Selina understood then why she had not been paraded, why she had not been killed, why she had been hidden underground. The cell was not simply a prison for her. It was containment for a problem too volatile to display. The bond made him her captor and her shield simultaneously. Kale did not speak. He did not need to. The air itself carried what he could not say, that he could not bring himself to finish her, even if his entire life had been built around the destruction of everything that carried her blood. That he had carried her from the battlefield not as mercy, but because something older than hatred had taken control of his body. Selina's pulse hammered in her throat. Her wolf pressed forward in her mind, pushing awareness of him until it became almost unbearable. She hated the weakness of that response. She hated that her own instincts betrayed the logic that screamed he was enemy. Yet the bond did not ask for permission. It simply existed, weaving itself deeper with every shared breath. A second set of footsteps entered the corridor. Heavier, slower, weighted with authority. Kale's posture changed instantly, becoming sharper, more defensive, as if he had been caught in a moment of vulnerability. Selina's wolf flinched, sensing something vast and dangerous approaching. King Rowan Morrow emerged from the shadows, like a storm given human form. He was older than Kale, but his presence was larger, carved by war and grief into something unyielding. His hair was threaded with gray, his face lined with scars and hard angles, his eyes a fierce gold that felt ancient and merciless. He wore armor even here in the underground, not ceremonial but practical, marked and worn, the kind of armor a man kept on because removing it felt like inviting death. He stopped in front of Selina's cell and looked at her the way one looked at a symbol, not a person. His gaze dropped to the crest on the discarded armor, and Selina felt the air change. Hatred radiated from him with a clarity that made her stomach tighten. It was not fresh anger. It was cultivated, preserved, fed for years. It had the density of grief that never healed. Rowan had not come to see a prisoner. He had come to see proof. Selina realized with sudden, sick certainty that this man did not need to know her story. He did not care why she had been on the battlefield. He did not care whether she had been forced there, whether she had run, whether she had fought for her own reasons. In his mind, she represented a single, unchangeable thing: Lyris. The betrayal that had killed his mate. The wound that had shaped his kingdom. The justification for war. Rowan's attention shifted to Kale, and Selina felt tension tighten between father and son like a wire pulled too far. Kale stood slightly in front of the cell now, not fully blocking it, but positioned in a way that made his intent unmistakable. He had not drawn a weapon, yet his stance carried refusal. Rowan's expression sharpened as if he had already anticipated defiance and had come prepared to crush it. The underground corridor felt suddenly too small to hold what was building there. Guards appeared at a distance, silhouettes at the edge of torchlight, hesitant to approach too closely. Even they seemed to sense that what was unfolding was not a normal interrogation, but something more personal and far more dangerous. Selina watched in stillness, her mind working fast. She understood that Nocteria's king would want her dead not only for vengeance, but for strategy. Lyris would come for her if they learned she lived. Lyris would use her as a justification for siege, for escalation, for any violence they already desired. Her existence would become a weapon no matter what she wanted. If she died quietly, Rowan could deny knowledge, could claim battle took her, could close a chapter cleanly. If she lived, the war would sharpen. Rowan moved closer to the bars, and Selina's wolf recoiled, sensing the shape of a predator that had survived too many winters. The king's gaze pinned Selina with a cold finality, as if he were measuring how quickly the problem could be removed. Cale stepped directly between Rowan and the cell. It was not dramatic, it was not loud. It was unmistakable. For the first time since Selina had seen him, Cale's control looked strained, as if he were holding back not only his anger but something deeper, something that threatened to fracture him. The bond between Cale and Selina flared in response to the confrontation, reacting like a living thing under threat. Selina felt it as heat, as pressure, as a pulse that urged closeness even as iron separated them. Rowan's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise at Cale's position, but with the realization of what that position meant. The mate bond had rules. It had consequences. It could not be negotiated with. Selina saw the moment the truth settled into Rowan's face like poison. Horror threaded through the hatred, twisting it into something worse. Fate had not merely played a cruel joke. It had bound his heir to Lyris blood. To the enemy. To the daughter of a kingdom that had taken everything from him. Rowan's rage became something larger, something almost sacred in its intensity. Selina could feel it, thickening the air, making every breath harder. The underground corridor seemed to vibrate with restrained violence. Cale remained in place. He did not beg. He did not soften. His refusal was absolute, not because he had become merciful, but because the bond had rewritten the laws of his body. Selina understood then that he was not choosing her out of kindness. He was choosing because the alternative was impossible. Killing her would have meant tearing out his own soul. Rowan's authority did not break, but it shifted. He did not yield. He recalculated. Selina watched him work through options with the cold efficiency of a king who had survived war by making decisions quickly and living with the blood that followed. In the end, he chose a path that preserved his power and punished his son without collapsing the kingdom's stability. The decision settled over the corridor like a sentence carved into stone. Selina would not be executed now. She would be returned. In 3 days, she would be handed over at the gates to the king of Lyris, publicly, so that Nocteria would appear strong, controlled, unwilling to negotiate. She would be removed from Nocteria's walls before Lyris could claim she had been stolen. She would be used as a sacrifice to prevent a larger catastrophe, even if catastrophe came anyway. Cale would be forbidden from returning to the dungeon, forbidden from approaching the cell, forbidden from letting the bond dictate his actions again. If he disobeyed, the consequences would be dynastic, not personal. His inheritance, his position, his future as king would be threatened. Rowan would force him to choose between crown and bond, duty and instinct, mother's memory and the living truth fate had chained to him. Selina's throat tightened as the implications settled in. She had run from being owned by her father only to become a bargaining piece between kingdoms. Even here, even in enemy stone, her agency remained something others tried to trade. Yet beneath that, something else stirred. Cale's eyes flicked to her once, and Selina felt the bond pulse in a way that was almost painful. He looked at her as if she were both curse and necessity, as if he hated what she represented and could not stop needing what she was. That contradiction wrapped itself around Selina's ribs and squeezed. It was the darkest kind of intimacy. Not comfort, not safety, but the knowledge that two enemies could be trapped in the same fate. Rowan turned away without another look at Selina, his presence receding down the corridor like a closing door. Guards followed, their armor clinking softly, the sound swallowed by stone. Within moments, the underground returned to its damp quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was loaded with what had been declared and what could not be undone. Cale did not leave immediately. He remained near the bars, close enough now that Selina could feel his warmth through the iron. The bond urged contact, pushed sensation outward until the space between them felt charged. Selina's wolf pressed forward, restless, recognizing him in a way that threatened to override fear. Selina fought for control, refusing to let instinct turn her into something mindless. Cale's hands tightened at his sides. His breathing deepened, uneven for the first time. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, aware that any movement would be a fall. Selina watched him with the same ruthless clarity she had used to survive Lyris. She saw what war had made of him, what grief had sharpened, and what fate had just cracked open. He was not her salvation. He was her danger. And he was the only person in this kingdom who could not ignore that she was alive. Selina realized that the dungeon had become something more than captivity. It had become a boundary between two kinds of death. One was the death her father had planned for her, slow and elegant, wrapped in ceremony and obedience. The other was the death this bond threatened to deliver, a life tethered to an enemy, pulled between hatred and need until neither remained pure. She sat on the cot and held herself still, forcing calm into her muscles. The wound in her shoulder continued to knit, a steady ache that reminded her she had survived. Outside, Cale stood like a guard and a prisoner at once, locked in place by something he did not choose. In the cold underground of Noctaria, dark romance did not bloom in softness. It took shape in iron and consequence, in the brutal knowledge that desire could be a chain, and fate could be the cruelest kind of captor. The hatred inside Noctaria did not rise suddenly. It simmered, thick and slow, fed by memory and loss until it filled every corridor of the castle like smoke trapped beneath stone. The people remembered blood. They remembered burned villages and empty homes, remembered sons and mates carried back on shields. Soldiers remembered funerals held too often, banners folded too many times. The name Lyris was not just a rival kingdom to them. It was a wound that had never been allowed to close. The presence of a living aristocrat from Lyris inside the castle did not inspire curiosity. It ignited something close to hunger. Words spread quickly, distorted by anger and repetition. The story of the noblewoman captured on the battlefield became sharper and uglier with every retelling. Some said she had been leading troops. Others claimed she had slaughtered Noctarian soldiers herself. Truth no longer mattered. She was a symbol, and symbols were easier to hate than people. Guards were reassigned, not to protect the prisoner from escape, but to protect her from the castle itself. When the time came to move Selina from the underground, the corridors filled before she ever stepped into them. Stone walls that had once carried only the echo of boots now carried voices, rough and venomous. Faces appeared from alcoves and stairwells, eyes bright with fury, mouths twisted with words that no longer needed sound to be understood. Spittle struck the floor near her feet. Rotten scraps and pebbles followed. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of collective resentment. Selina walked straight. Her back remained rigid, her steps measured, her head held level. She did not rush, and she did not slow. She understood instinctively that fear would be read as weakness, and weakness would invite violence. In Lyris, she had learned to perform obedience. Here, she learned to perform defiance without a single word. Each step was an act of refusal, a declaration that she would not shrink to make others comfortable. The wolf inside her stayed quiet, coiled and watchful, absorbing the hostility without reacting. Selena felt its awareness pressed tight against her spine, alert to sudden movement, ready to tear free if the line broke. But the line held. Spears and shields kept the crowd at bay, the guards tense and sweating, aware that one wrong motion could turn order into massacre. Above them, the castle gates stood open to daylight. Beyond the stone archway stretched the open ground between walls and horizon, flattened by centuries of war and ceremony alike. Banners snapped in the wind, white and gold against the darkening sky. The army of Lyris had already assembled there, ranks precise, armor polished, weapons gleaming with a discipline that looked impressive from a distance and hollow up close. At the center of it all sat King Draven Raywood. He was mounted on a black horse, its posture trained into stillness beneath him. His armor bore no dents, no scars, no marks of battle. It was ceremonial perfection, crafted to intimidate and inspire rather than protect. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, as if he had arrived for a negotiation he already knew the outcome of. When Selena emerged into the light, his gaze found her immediately. He did not look relieved. He did not look afraid. He looked irritated. Selena recognized the expression with brutal clarity. It was the same look he had worn when she disappointed him as a child, when she asked questions he had no intention of answering, when she existed in ways that complicated his designs. She was not a daughter to him in that moment. She was a complication that should have been resolved already. The realization struck her harder than any insult. Across the open ground, Noctaria's forces gathered along the walls, tense and silent. King Rowan Morrow stood at the front, armored and unmoving, his presence anchoring the chaos behind him. He watched Draven with eyes that carried decades of restrained violence. Beside him stood Kale, rigid and silent, his body coiled with a fury that had nowhere to go. The space between the armies vibrated with expectation. Selena felt the bond tighten as she stepped closer to the edge of the gate. Kale's awareness flared in response, sharp and immediate, as if her proximity to danger sent shockwaves through his body. She did not look at him. Not yet. She knew that if she did, the fragile control she maintained would fracture. Draven began to advance his narrative before either king could claim the moment. He framed the situation as theft, as violation, as insult to sovereignty. He cast Selena as property taken unlawfully, a possession withheld. He spoke of honor and tradition, of rights and retaliation. Each word landed heavily on the open field, shaped to provoke and justify rather than explain. Selena listened, stunned not by the cruelty of his version, but by its familiarity. She had grown up inside this language, wrapped in it until it felt like truth. Now, standing between walls and armies, she heard it stripped of elegance, reduced to its core. Ownership. Rowan did not let the narrative stand. He answered not with poetry, but with facts sharpened into weapons. He spoke of an invasion carried out under the guise of peace, of a queen murdered inside her own halls, unarmed and unprepared. He spoke of a child left kneeling in blood. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. He let the weight of the truth do the work. The field went still. Selena felt the ground shift beneath her understanding. The stories she had been fed since childhood cracked open, their polished surfaces splitting to reveal rot beneath. She had been taught that Noctaria struck first, that its queen died in fair conflict, that war was mutual inevitability. Hearing the events laid bare, stripped of justification, made something inside her collapse completely. She had not just been lied to. She had been shaped by the lie. The pressure inside her chest built rapidly, compressing breath and thought alike. She felt the urge to retreat, to let the kings continue their exchange while she remained silent as expected. Silence had always been her assigned role. Silence had kept her alive. But silence had also kept the truth buried. Selena stepped forward. The movement was small, barely a stride, but it fractured the moment like a blade through glass. Every eye turned to her. Soldiers shifted. Archers tensed. The wolf surged, not in rage, but in clarity, urging her to claim space that had never been hers before. She did not beg. She did not ask for protection. She exposed what had been hidden behind her name for her entire life. She laid bare the lies that had fueled the war, the manipulation that had turned her into a tool, the way her father had built authority on fear and obedience rather than loyalty or truth. She spoke not as a rebel seeking asylum, but as someone refusing to be returned to a cage she now understood completely. The effect was immediate and volatile. Draven's composure fractured into fury. He branded her defiance as betrayal, his anger sharp and absolute. To him, her refusal was not moral resistance but theft of control. He reacted the only way he ever had when challenged, with force. A command rippled through the ranks of Lyris. Soldiers moved forward, boots striking the ground in unison, weapons lowered with purpose. The threat became tangible, no longer contained in words. Kale moved without hesitation. He stepped directly between Selena and the advancing soldiers, his body a barrier that radiated lethal intent. He did not draw his weapon. He did not need to. His presence alone communicated consequence. The bond between him and Selena flared violently, pulling tight until the air around them seemed charged. Rowan followed. The older king positioned himself beside his son, the decision written into his stance. Selena understood the cost of that movement instantly. Rowan was not merely protecting her. He was choosing to fracture the fragile restraint that kept war at bay. He was choosing his son's survival over political convenience. The field teetered on the edge of bloodshed. Kale claimed the truth aloud. He did not dress it in sentiment. He did not soften it for public comfort. He stated the bond as fact, as law older than any crown present. In doing so, he detonated every remaining illusion of containment. The mate bond was not a private tragedy anymore. It was a public reality. The reaction rippled through both armies like a shockwave. Gasps, murmurs, fury, disbelief. The idea of Noctaria's heir bound to Lyris blood was unthinkable, sacrilegious, destabilizing. It undermined everything the war had been built on. It demanded answers no one was prepared to give. Draven laughed. Not in humor, but in satisfaction twisted into cruelty. To him, the revelation was not a complication. It was leverage. He seized it immediately, issuing an ultimatum that reframed the moment into a countdown. Time was set. Lines were drawn. The implication was clear: surrender the girl or prepare for siege. Rowan gave the order to close the gates. Massive stone doors began to move, grinding against their hinges, sealing Noctaria from the open field. Inside the walls, horns sounded and commands echoed as defenses shifted into place. Outside, Lyris's forces began to spread, tents rising with practiced efficiency, siege lines forming like scars across the earth. The war, long simmering, crossed the point of inevitability. Selena stood between Kale and the closing gates, her body vibrating with the aftermath of everything she had unleashed. Fear coiled low in her gut, sharp and real, but it did not overpower her. For the first time in her life, she had spoken truth in a place where truth had consequences. The weight of it settled over her like armor. As the gates sealed shut, Kale's hand brushed hers. It was brief, barely a touch. Yet the bond flared with such intensity that Selena's breath caught. The contact carried no promises, no comfort. It carried choice. He had stepped between her and an army. He had spoken words that could not be taken back. He had chosen her knowing exactly what it would cost. The stone doors locked into place with a final, echoing sound. Beyond them, camps spread and war drums began to beat, slow and relentless. Within the walls, Noctaria braced itself for what was coming. Selena stood still, her fate no longer hidden or controlled by others. The truth had detonated in the open, and there would be no surviving it unchanged. The siege did not begin with an explosion or a charge. It began with rhythm. The drums of Lyris beat beyond the walls of Noctaria, slow and deliberate, a measured pulse that seeped through stone and bone alike. They sounded at dawn and again at dusk, never rushing, never faltering. Each strike carried intention rather than urgency, a reminder that time itself had been turned into a weapon. Inside the castle, the sound threaded through corridors and chambers, through sleep and waking, through thought. It became impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. It counted down, without ever stating what waited at the end. Within 3 days, Noctaria ceased to feel like a fortress and began to feel like a living body under pressure. The gates remained sealed. Supplies were inventoried and rationed. Patrols doubled, then tripled. Every archer knew their post. Every runner knew their route. The castle breathed differently, tense and contained, its movements precise but strained. Discipline held, but fear lived just beneath it, unspoken and shared. Hunger arrived quietly, not as starvation, but as awareness, as the knowledge that every loaf of bread and every barrel of water mattered now. Selena was moved from the dungeon on the first night of the siege. The relocation was efficient and silent, carried out under heavy guard. She was taken upward through stairwells that spiraled tightly, past arrow slits and sealed doors, until the air grew thinner and colder. Her new quarters occupied a narrow tower chamber overlooking the eastern wall. The room was bare but intact, its stone walls etched with old marks from long-forgotten conflicts. A single window, cut into the stone, allowed a view of the encampment below, where thousands of fires burned each night like a fallen constellation. Guards were stationed outside her door at all times. They were not there to prevent escape. They were there to prevent contact. Hatred did not vanish because a king commanded it to. It shifted shape, retreated into whispers and looks and clenched fists. Selena felt it every time she moved through a corridor under escort, every time eyes followed her with open resentment or barely restrained violence. To many within Noctaria, she was still the enemy's blood, the living reminder of graves that would never be filled properly. Isolation became its own form of protection. From the tower window, Selena watched the enemy prepare with methodical patience. Lyris did not rush. Siege lines spread outward in calculated arcs. Supply wagons rolled into place. Engineers worked beneath cover of shields. The camps grew more organized by the hour, less chaotic, more permanent. It was not a bluff. It was intent. The wolf inside her recognized it immediately. This was not a war of desperation. It was a war of certainty. King Rowan Morrow spent those days walking the walls. He observed without interruption, listening to reports, inspecting defenses, correcting small errors that could become fatal later. His presence steadied the soldiers even as it reminded them of what was at stake. He did not sleep much. When he did, it was in fragments stolen between strategy sessions. Grief never left him, but it shifted, reshaping itself into something colder and more functional. He watched Selena as well. Not constantly, not openly, but enough to understand what she was not. She did not plead for mercy. She did not attempt to negotiate her own safety. She did not hide from the consequences of her defiance. When escorted along the battlements, she looked outward rather than inward, studying the siege lines with the same quiet focus she had used to observe the palace of her birth. Rowan recognized something unsettling in that posture. It reminded him of his wife. The memory struck him without warning, sharp and unwelcome. His mate had stood the same way in moments of crisis, spine straight, eyes clear, refusing to look away from approaching danger. She had not been a woman who begged fate for kindness. She had met it head-on and paid for it with her life. The comparison angered him at first. Then it forced him to reconsider. Selena was not her father. That truth did not absolve her blood, but it complicated it. Rowan saw a woman shaped by lies and control who had chosen to break rather than perpetuate them. He understood too well what it meant to be trapped inside a narrative built by someone else. The cycle of vengeance had cost him everything once already. Continuing it blindly promised only repetition. His decision came slowly, weighed against every instinct that screamed for retribution. When he announced publicly that Selena was under the protection of Nocteria's crown, the reaction was volatile. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers bristled openly. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to challenge the king directly. Rowan did not soften the decree. He did not justify it emotionally. He framed it as necessity, as survival, as an investment in an ending that did not demand endless graves. Accepting the bond between his son and the enemy's daughter was not forgiveness. It was endurance. Rowan knew the cost. He accepted it anyway. Cale lived those days stretched between obligation and instinct, every step pulled tight by the bond. He remained near the front lines, directing defenses, coordinating patrols, refusing to retreat into the safety of command rooms. Distance did not sever the connection. It sharpened it. He felt Selena's presence constantly, a low, insistent awareness beneath his thoughts, reminding him that she existed, that she feared, that she remained alive. The bond did not soothe him. It tortured him with proximity he could not claim. Cale tried to keep Selena away from the walls, away from the reality of the siege. He ordered guards to limit her exposure, to keep her in the tower, to shield her from what was coming. It was not kindness. It was fear disguised as control, the instinct to protect by hiding. Selena rejected it. She understood too well what it meant to be locked away for her own good. She refused to be preserved while others bled on her behalf. Each death outside the walls would be counted against her existence, whispered as justification for resentment. She did not want to be the reason men died while she watched from stone. Her insistence unsettled Cale more than defiance ever could. It forced him to see her not as a liability to be guarded, but as an actor in the outcome to come. The bond responded to her resolve with a fierce pull, recognizing strength where fear had been expected. Cale did not argue further. He could not deny her without denying the truth of what bound them. As the third night fell, the castle quieted in a way that felt unnatural. The drums continued outside, steady and relentless, but inside, voices dropped to whispers. Torches burned lower. Even the guards moved with more caution, as if the stone itself might fracture under careless steps. Everyone understood that dawn would bring decision. That night, Selena and Cale were allowed a moment of isolation that felt almost illicit. The world did not disappear. Guards remained at a distance. Walls still pressed in. Politics and war hovered just beyond reach. But for a brief span of time, they occupied the same space without interruption, without pretense. There were no promises made. None were possible. Their closeness was not marked by softness or comfort. It was sharp, electric, threaded with the knowledge that loss waited on the other side of sleep. Cale felt every beat of Selena's heart as if it were his own, uneven but steady, driven by stubborn refusal to yield. Selena felt the restraint in his body, the way violence coiled beneath his skin, not toward her, but toward the world that threatened her. Fear moved between them, no longer something to hide from, but something shared. The bond shifted in that space, not deepening through romance, but through recognition. They were not bound because they were gentle or kind or destined for happiness. They were bound because fate had chosen to test whether hatred could be endured without becoming identity. Selena memorized the warmth of Cale's presence, the weight of him near enough to feel without touch. She understood with quiet clarity that this might be the last night they shared breath in the same room. If one of them fell tomorrow, the bond would not break cleanly. It would linger, a wound that never closed, turning survival into slow erosion. Cale knew the same. He did not pretend otherwise. He allowed himself to feel the fear fully, to let it sharpen his resolve rather than weaken it. The wolf within him did not rage. It waited, alert and focused, prepared to protect at any cost. When they finally separated, it was without ceremony. The night outside remained dark, broken only by distant fires and the dull echo of drums. Within the castle, Noctaria held itself together through discipline alone, bracing for impact. Fear had become a link rather than a fracture. By dawn, the walls would bleed or hold. Either way, nothing would remain untouched. Dawn broke without mercy. The gates of Noctaria opened as the first gray light spilled across the field, revealing a landscape already scarred by preparation and waiting. Fog clung low to the ground, torn apart by movement and sound, as two forces surged forward to meet each other. The earth trembled beneath boots, hooves, and claws. Metal rang against metal. The air filled with the raw roar of wolves answering the call to blood and dominance. The war that had waited for decades finally took form. Selena crossed the threshold beside Cale, not hidden, not shielded, but visible to every eye that searched for her name in the chaos. She wore armor forged specifically for her body, light enough to move, strong enough to endure. It bore no sigil of Lyris or Noctaria, only functional lines shaped for survival. For the first time, she was not wrapped in borrowed steel or ceremonial restraint. She was exactly what the battlefield demanded. The first clash came like a breaking wave. Lines collided and shattered into smaller, desperate struggles. Discipline dissolved into instinct as formations bent under pressure. Selena moved with calculated economy, every step deliberate, every strike chosen. She did not fight to impress or to prove worth. She fought to stay alive and to keep others alive around her. The wolf within her stayed restrained, not suppressed, waiting for the moment when release would mean advantage rather than waste. That moment came amid collapse. A breach opened where Noctaria's left flank faltered under concentrated assault. Selena saw it before command could respond. She felt Cale register the same danger through the bond, his attention snapping toward her location even as he fought elsewhere. Without hesitation, she shifted, bones reforming in a rush of heat and violence that burned through pain and fear alike. The transformation was brutal and brief, her wolf surging forward not in blind rage, but in precision. She tore through the gap with lethal focus. The impact changed the flow of battle instantly. Noctarian soldiers rallied behind her advance, momentum restored through decisive action rather than shouted orders. Selena shifted back as quickly as she had changed, exhaustion biting deep, but the line held. The legend that followed her into the fight fractured visibly in that moment. She was no longer the tyrant's daughter dragged into war by circumstance. She was an active force reshaping it. Across the field, King Draven Raywood searched for spectacle. He did not fight for victory measured in territory or survival. He fought for ending. His strategy aimed not at breaking Noctaria's defenses slowly, but at delivering a singular, crushing blow that would echo through history. His gaze cut through the chaos until it found Rowan Morrow near the center, armored and commanding amid the storm. Draven moved toward him with calculated inevitability. Cale sensed it before he saw it. The bond flared with warning, sharp and urgent, pulling his attention away from the immediate threat before him. He shifted instantly, wolf form exploding outward with terrifying force, launching himself into the path Draven had chosen. The collision of alphas cracked stone beneath them, shock rippling through nearby combatants who stumbled back from the impact. The fight between them became something older than the war around it. It was not merely strength against strength. It was intent against intent. Draven fought with cruelty refined into habit, each movement designed to dominate and humiliate. Cale fought with controlled ferocity, shaped by loss but tempered by choice. Their struggle tore furrows into the ground, blood darkening the soil as claws and steel found purchase. Nocteria did not rush to finish it. They surrounded instead. At Rowan's signal, elite warriors moved in coordination, not to kill but to contain. They understood what capture meant in a war built on hierarchy. Draven's power did not lie only in his body. It lay in his position. Removing him alive would fracture Lyris more thoroughly than slaughter ever could. The restraint succeeded at brutal cost. Pinned and wounded, Draven was forced back into human form, stripped of momentum and myth alike. His army faltered visibly as the sight rippled outward. Confusion replaced certainty. Orders ceased to travel cleanly. Without their alpha's forward drive, the assault lost coherence. Weapons lowered one by one. The battlefield stilled, littered with bodies and breathless survivors, the silence that followed heavier than the noise had been. Judgment was not delayed. By ancient law, the fate of a captured alpha could not be decided in shadow. The field itself became a court, the blood-soaked ground bearing witness. The terms were absolute and merciless, designed to end cycles rather than prolong them. Death would erase the threat permanently. Exile would strip power and identity alike. Transfer of rule would dismantle the structure that had fueled the war. Draven was brought forward to face the consequences of his own design. For the first time, he looked at Selena without calculation clouding his eyes. She stood among Noctarian ranks, bloodied, exhausted, unbowed. She was not the controlled figure he had shaped for alliance and obedience. She was the variable he had failed to contain. The realization unsettled him more than the wounds. He understood quickly that execution would turn him into martyr, a symbol around which future hatred could gather. Exile would reduce him to nothing, but it would also leave his legacy intact within Lyris. Only one choice dismantled everything he had built. He relinquished the crown. The decision passed through the field like a tremor, disbelief rippling through soldiers who had never imagined Lyris without his rule. The transfer stripped him of authority instantly, ancient law binding power to blood and lineage without room for appeal. The second choice followed without pause, severing his claim entirely. Name, title, protection, all dissolved in a single motion. Draven Raywood ceased to exist as king. Selena received the signet of Lyris with hands that trembled not from fear, but from understanding. The weight of it carried no triumph. It carried obligation so vast it threatened to crush breath from her lungs. Victory revealed itself not as relief, but as responsibility multiplied by grief. She did not celebrate. She looked across the field at soldiers from both sides, wounded and stunned, trying to comprehend an ending they had not been prepared to see. She understood that hatred did not vanish because a crown changed hands. Trust would not bloom because blood had been spilled. What waited was work, relentless and unforgiving. Kale stood beside her, the bond steady and present, no longer hidden or deniable. Their connection was no longer a private fracture between enemies. It had become a visible axis around which two kingdoms would now turn. Dark romance did not fade into softness. It hardened into commitment forged under scrutiny and consequence. Rowan watched them with eyes shaped by memory. He saw in Selena a chance denied to his own past, an opportunity to end a cycle rather than feed it. He did not absolve her father's crimes through her. He acknowledged instead the cost of choosing differently and accepted it as the only path forward. Loss had taught him that survival without change was simply delayed destruction. The weeks that followed were marked not by peace, but by exhaustion. Armies withdrew slowly. Borders stabilized under watchful negotiation. Mourning filled both kingdoms, public and private, uneven and unresolved. Selena worked without rest, confronting resistance within Lyris from those who had thrived under fear and control. She faced them without flinching, wielding authority not as domination, but as accountability. Kale became a bridge not through charm, but through presence. He stood with her in councils that bristled with suspicion, his loyalty clear and costly. The bond between them did not soften politics. It complicated it, forcing truth where convenience had ruled. Their partnership was not idealized. It was tested constantly, forged in pressure rather than promise. Months passed before the alliance was formalized. When it came, it did not arrive as celebration. It arrived as necessity, signed by hands that had buried too many dead. The treaty bound Lyris and Noctaria together not through forgiveness, but through refusal to continue the same destruction. It was imperfect and fragile, but it held. Selena was crowned Queen of Lyris under an open sky. She wore no excessive ornament, only the symbols required by law and tradition. Her gaze remained steady as the crown settled, the past pressing close even as the future demanded space. She understood that ruling would not redeem what had been done in her name. It would only determine what followed. Far from the throne, a lone figure walked unnamed roads. Stripped of banners and protection, the former king moved through a world that no longer feared him. Power had abandoned him the moment others chose not to be afraid. Understanding came late and useless, echoing in silence rather than halls. In Noctaria and Lyris alike, the story began to change. It was not told as a miracle or a perfect love. It was remembered as a reckoning, a reminder that cycles end not when hatred is defeated by force, but when someone refuses to inherit it. The blood that had soaked the field gave way to judgment, and judgment gave way to a new crown heavy with consequence. The war ended not because the world was healed, but because it was finally forced to stop repeating the same murder again. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.